Our next presenter is Zoe Phillips. Zoe joined the SSFS community in 2012 as a fifth grader. This fall, Zoe will enroll in the University of Maryland at College Park, just down the street from her home in University Park. Aspiring to create through writing and the arts, Zoe plans to major in English as an undergraduate student. When pressed for a fun fact, Zoe shared, "In middle school, my most unique skill was being able to produce a lifelike crow noise." Zoe added, "This presentation is dedicated to those afflicted with mental health and those who want to better understand it, and is inspired by Cy Twombly's 50 Days at Ilium." Zoe, please feel free to share your presentation at this time. The stage is yours, friend.
Thank you and good evening, friends. For the past 7 years, one of my most important personal identifiers has been as a mentally ill person. And over those years, I have accumulated a colorful and extensive list of diagnoses. With that list has come a wealth of experience about what it means to be mentally ill. I'm aware that some people may be uncomfortable with this term, but for my purposes tonight, I will be using it as a self-identifier and do not intend in any way to force the term onto others. Everything in this presentation is based on my personal life experience. If you are curious to learn more about any of the conditions I discuss, I encourage you to do your own research. For now, I would like to welcome everyone to my Headspace. I'm starting at the root of my mental illness tree, anxiety. Anxiety, in its most basic definition, is a disorder that causes a level of fear and stress in an individual that interferes with daily life. The level of stress any other person might have while in a boxing match with a grizzly bear is a level I have when I lose my hair tie or I'm crossing a sparse intersection. It is the loss of control of rational thought in day-to-day situations. Anxiety is many things. Anxiety is the feeling of having to fight a battle anytime you want to get something done. Tasks looming over your head, like a ferocious monster that you are unable to beat, but unable to flee from. A constant cycle of fighting and losing and winning, with no sense of victory or accomplishment. It's the feeling of your head swimming, thoughts rippling and fluctuating like a school of fish that the very sight of makes you dizzy and nauseous. It is the feeling of being stranded in an ocean-like void with only your fears, worries, and failures to keep you company. Anxiety is looking at your life through the holes of a box, like a sad cartoon who shuffles about in their makeshift hiding place, unable to escape past the confines of their cardboard prison. It is your head, spirited away by the clouds and reaching even though your arms are too short, because you know if you cannot get it back, people will say you didn't try hard enough. Anxiety is like a supernova, both exploding and collapsing at the same time. Everything around you and everything in your mind becoming bigger and bigger, while you become smaller and smaller. It is climbing a rope ladder that never ends, the rest of the world always just in sight above you, wondering what is taking you so long. It is the apocalypse, every day, but you survive, and it is exhausting. The following pieces were produced during a panic attack, which I experienced as a sudden certainty of imminent death. Take a moment to quietly compare these to my previous pieces, and try to imagine the state of my brain that led me to produce these images. Next is a much less familiar condition that is surprisingly common, FND, or functional neurological disorder. This large family of disorders is peculiar because it presents with neurological symptoms that are not compatible with any currently established medical illness. Here is just one way that FND affects me. This is a video of me purchasing paint for this project 6 months ago. My arms are flapping back and forth and my head is jerking side to side. If you're curious, try copying the motions you see in the video as I talk. The motions shouldn't be gentle and either leave your wrists completely loose or lock them firmly. These involuntary motions are a subtype of functional neurological disorder called a functional movement disorder. It leads to movements in my hands, arms, shoulder, neck, head, face, eyes, mouth, and tongue that are out of my control. This is a very old disorder, and it is believed to be the cause of the uncontrolled movements made by the young girls in Salem, Massachusetts that led to the Salem witch trials. When I was first diagnosed, I missed 10 days of school over 4 weeks, during which I couldn't even drink out of a glass or stand upright. Just a few hours of even moderately strong shaking will leave your arms and head feeling waterlogged and heavy, like they're a separate part of your body that will eventually just give out. But there are no breaks, just riding the rise and fall of the tide as the motions go from deathly calm to violently angry. Your body twists and contorts in ways that it isn't supposed to, an impulse going down your arm, wrist, fingers to move in a way that bodies outside of horror films really shouldn't. It is the surrender of your control as you force yourself to breathe and slowly relax, even as your body is trying to unscrew your appendages at every joint. This picture is the only piece of art I managed to make on my movements while they were happening violently during the duration of this project, and it is from 3 weeks ago. Another way FND affects me is that sometimes it takes away my voice. During certain periods of time, ones of high anxiety usually, I lose my voice, words getting stuck in my throat in the least poetic way possible. Once this lasted an entire week. I'm ending with my most recent monsters, 2 hearing conditions that are tangled together in a mess of wire and fishhooks. First is misophonia, a condition where your brain amplifies quiet sounds and triggers a violent fight or flight reaction. Trigger sounds are those produced by people or animals and are often repetitive. Second is hyperacusis, a condition where your sensitivity to sounds is higher than normal and the brain registers loud noises as acute pain. In my world, every sound around me can feel like a physical assault. The meaning of each sound is drowned out by the volume of the greater cacophony that exists in day-to-day life. It's like your head is full of trash, a day's worth of abuse dribbling out of your ears. Each sound, a rusted can, a crumpled water bottle, plastic can holder, crammed into the limited space between your ears. I crave the silence at the end of the day when I can empty the trash and settle into the quiet. Now, many times during the 4 months that I worked on this project, I wondered, are my feelings something that can be conveyed to other people? I'll let you all be the judge of that. But before I sign off, I'd like to tell you why I think mental health is so hard to communicate and understand in the first place. Here's my theory. The works that I produced for this project can be divided into 2 categories, metaphorical and reactionary. Metaphorical pieces are ones that use recognizable imagery, color, and vivid details to express an emotion. They're pieces you can sit down with and read into for a long time, parsing out the allegories and metaphors into a coherent message. Reactionary pieces are just that, reactionary. There is no detailed thought behind them, and they don't use recognizable shapes and images. They're a projection of my brain in the moment and represent what I experience in the most literal sense while it is happening. While looking through these works, I noticed a strange pattern. The more reactionary a piece was, the more honest I felt it was to my true feelings. And the more metaphorical it was, the more contrived and mechanical the messages in it felt, manufactured. While writing the script for this presentation, I was constantly frustrated with how unemotional it was. I was never unconfident that I could explain my mental illnesses in a very accurate and clinical way, but no matter how I wrote it, it never carried any feeling. It was gray and lifeless. This was a frustration I have carried for many years. I've been praised many times for how articulate I am, able to rationalize what I go through to people who don't understand. People like my parents, my friends, my teachers, and the parents of others who have come to me asking, what is wrong with my child? But they listened, they processed, they used analogies to relate, but their understanding was shallow and emotionless, and I never felt like anyone truly understood. At some point, I realized that mental health communication is just like my art. I can sit here all day and tell you a heavily processed and metaphorical rendition of what I live and think and feel. But what I say has to be processed and manufactured to the point of distortion for all of you to be able to process it. It is cold and clinical communication that yields no deeper understanding. No understanding is deeper than what can be experienced when you see someone screaming, crying, binging, sleeping for 18 hours in one day. It is irrational, it is uncontrolled, it is reactionary, and it is honest. I'd like to leave you with the idea that mental illnesses are illnesses. They are not logical, they are not rational, and they do not speak in a language of words. My name is Zoe Phillips, and I am ill. Thank you for your time and attention this evening, and a special thanks to Sandy Spring Friends School, the Senior Projects Committee, and Eduardo Colon.
Thank you, Zoe, for this intimate and illuminating insight. Lauren, would you be so kind as to return us to our master slideshow now? Thank you. As we begin the formal Q&A, I am pleased once again to call on Lauren to introduce two more of tonight's special guest panelists. Lauren.
We have two alumni guest panelists, and I am actually going to be speaking for our first. Liza Jane Bernard is an SSFS alumna, class of 1968, and a longtime clerk of our Alumni Association Steering Committee. She's also in Pennsylvania, where they're being hit by storms, and I'm afraid her power has been knocked out. So Zoe, I know how much she was looking forward to this presentation and how much she'll enjoy seeing it on screen. I'm just going to read her question for you. So I'm channeling Liza Jane right now. Visual arts have served to convey or interpret cultures, beauty, distress, joy, and a host of other perspectives and emotions. Are there particular artists or architects or specific works that you appreciate and that have influenced your approach to this project?
Thank you for the question, Liza, and I'm sorry that you couldn't be able to present it yourself, but I'm very grateful you asked it because this is something I had hoped to touch on in the body of my presentation, but I ran out of time. Eduardo briefly mentioned it in my introduction, but I'm going to explain it a little further. So about a year and a half ago on a school trip with SSFS to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I was introduced to the artwork of a man called Cy Twombly for the first time in a collection of his called 50 Days at Ilium. And in it, it depicts the story of Achilles and the Trojan War as told by Homer. And I remember being very confused at first as to why his artwork was on display, because at a first glance, I thought his work was something that any 5-year-old with a box of crayons could produce. But despite that, I was so in awe of the raw emotions in his work that I probably sat in front of that collection for an hour before the teacher had to drag me away from it. I was in love with it because even though there were countlessly more technically impressive works down the hall, along with works by Van Gogh and Renoir, I'd never seen emotion expressed so plainly through any artistic medium, and I sought to emulate that. So thank you for your question again.
Thank you, Zoe. And our second panelist is Kip Imlay, Sandy Spring Friends School class of 1971, graduated parent and clerk of our Board of Trustees. Kip, you're up.
Thank you, Lauren. Zoe, that was one of the most articulate presentations I've ever heard from anyone in my entire life, and I congratulate you on a marvelous, marvelous presentation. Thank you so much for that. My question for you this evening relates more to your metaphorical works than to the reactionary works. And it's premised on the idea that we have a unique opportunity to speak directly to the artist this evening. You know, I'm aware that interpretation of art is inherently subjective, and so I'd like to cut through some of the subjectivity with respect to the metaphorical works that you introduced this evening, and ask, with respect to each of those works, what were the fundamental ideas and premises and preconceptions that occurred to you or that you had in mind before you started work on the works, on the individual expression of the works? And how are those ideas reflected in the structure, the color, and the basic medium of the works?
Thank you for your question. I would love to talk at length about all of the kind of thoughts and experimentation that went into all the different works I made. And at some point, I would like to make that available for people to see, but I don't think I can answer tonight this question with respect to any of my individual works, but I can give you a two-part response for my project as a whole. And for my first answer, I'm going to quote right out of my proposal for my entire project, which will connect into the art. The fundamental idea I had going into this project was that verbal communication of mental illness just wasn't cutting it. And somehow I needed to find a universal medium to be able to tell my story in a way that would impact others on an emotional level. The premise was that art would be that universal medium, as you mentioned. And I was hoping that I could use images to transcend language barriers that make communication of issues so important, so difficult. I hoped I could reach more people in a more effective and direct manner. And the preconceptions I considered were that most people don't know very much about mental health and might have trouble responding to a lecture on it, which would be counterintuitive to my entire purpose. So I went in hoping art would be more palatable. But my second answer is something that I hinted on in my conclusion, but I'm going to go over again. A good way through the project, I started noticing the divide between my two works that you mentioned, of reactionary and metaphorical. And I started noticing that the ones that were more honest but less clever were more honest, and others that were more technically impressive were a bit two-dimensional. And it was at that point that I realized having fundamental ideas, premises, and preconceptions was distracting. It was distracting me from what my initial goal was to. The more I thought about how I could sneakily lead people into understanding the meaning of the piece, or how I could implement color theory and other things and metaphors to try to make people get it, the more distracted I became from the original goal, expressing mental health. So while I did go into this project and a lot of the individual pieces with certain ideas and preconceptions, I realized in the end trying to juggle my mindset and the mindset of others was honestly a waste of my time and missed the entire point of my project. So thank you for that thoughtful question. And I'd love to have a platform to go into more depth on that later. So thank you.
Thank you. That was marvelous. Thank you very much.
Once again, thank you, Zoe, for this truly enlightening insight. Special thanks again to our guest panelists. Your time is so generous. Your questions are so thoughtful. Lauren, would you please take us to the next slide? Friends, please, if you haven't already, and tons of comments have been pouring in to the chat box. If you'd like, there's one more opportunity to take a moment to use the chat feature to type a shout out celebrating Zoe and her presentation.